Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings. In this current series, we're talking about individual poems, and the poems we've selected are poems that seem to us in some way to be political. That's to say, they articulate political opinions, or they respond to particular political events, or perhaps they just strike up some interesting relationship with the politics that are going on around them. My name is Seamus Perry, and I'm a tutor in English at Balliol College in Oxford. And I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College, London. And today we've a poem, the politics of which are perhaps much less to do with questions of ideology or political position-taking than in a more intuitive, perhaps, response to an overwhelming political crisis, which is to say, international war waged on an unprecedented scale. Because the poem we've chosen is Strange Meeting, by Wilfred Owen, written in the first months of 1918, but not, Mark, written at the front.
No, and in fact, Owen only spent about 10 weeks at the front. I mean, it's interesting to think about Owen's posthumous career and the ways in which he emerged as the most famous, the most resonant, the most powerful of the First World War poets. And Strange Meeting has played a major role in the canonization of Owen's oeuvre, which is a very slim one. He was only 25 when he died. He wrote most of his poetry in a sort of brief period, starting when he was in a hospital in Scotland, Craiglockhart, on the outskirts of Edinburgh, and in 1917, and then through to the summer of 1918, autumn of 1918, and he dies just a week before the armistice. So his career is a very sort of brief one. But he had been obsessed with poetry from a young age, and particularly with the poetry of Keats. And John Keats, as well as Shelley, are very strong influences on Strange Meeting in particular. But Keats was his kind of god, really. He goes down to Teignmouth, where Keats writes Endymion, and he writes a poem to Keats, a sonnet addressing Keats. And he adored Keats, and he saw Keats as embodying his ideal of poetry in the most powerful of ways. He studies Keats's manuscripts. And I think one of the reasons, to give us kind of overview, that Owen's poetry finds such a much more willing or readership than that of, say, Sassoon, is the kind of romanticism of it, the ways in which it fuses with all the imagery of the trenches, a kind of romance which derives from his readings in Keats and Shelley and his concept of the poet as a kind of Keatsian recorder of senses and desires, and the satirical bits of Sassoon fuse with the kind of romance or romantic aspects of Owen's sensibility to create this very powerful mixture of both realist depictions of what it was like to be at the front with a kind of high romantic sublime. And it's that unstable and rather vulnerable mixture that you get in Owen's idiom, which I think strikes such a chord with readers. There is a kind of vulnerability about the ways in which his poetry operates, which is just not true of Sassoon's, which is satirical and in some ways black humorous. And the same is true of that of Robert Graves, I think, as well.
Okay, so let's fill in the backstory there a little bit. Owen is sent back from the front in May 1917 because he's got shell shock, which was a phrase used at the time, sometimes used with a slightly suspicious air, wasn't it? Like that you were perhaps not as ill as you were making out to be, but he certainly seemed to have been just knocked to pieces by his experiences in the trenches. In June, he's sent, as you say, to Craiglockhart, which is, I suppose, a psychiatric institution quite close to Edinburgh. And then, as you've already mentioned, Siegfried Sassoon turns up in late July. But it's important, isn't it, that Sassoon isn't sent to Craiglockhart because he's got shell shock. He's in Craiglockhart for different reasons.
Absolutely. I mean, he was, you might say, turned by Lady Ottoline Morell and Bertrand Russell. Having been known as Mad Jack, this kind of war hero, he suddenly realised that the war, he saw it as a war of aggression. And he makes a famous statement which is read out in Parliament saying that it is now a war of aggression. He is no longer a willing combatant and that it should be stopped. And the authorities in their wisdom think rather than sort of dealing with Mad Jack, send him up to Craiglockhart and pretend he's ill. And he was quite famous by this time, or his first book, Counterattack, was published that year. And Owen was in awe of him. And I think we should say at once that both Owen and Sassoon were gay. And when Owen finally summons up the courage, because Sassoon is from a lordly aristocratic background, he's very wealthy, goes to public school, Oxford, or was it Cambridge? I forget which. I think it was Oxford. Owen leaves school, comes from a lower middle class evangelical background. He finally summons up the courage, and Owen to knock on Sassoon's door. Sassoon opens it. He's in a purple dressing gown and cleaning his golf clubs. Sort of dramatizes the difference between them. And Owen was pretty short, 5 foot something. Sassoon was 6 foot something. So it's rather like the dynamic between Keats and Shelley in that sense. And Sassoon, Owen rather, shows Sassoon some of his rather kind of 90s-ish, decadent, Swinburnian poems, which are already, though, using off-rhyme, his characteristic off-rhyme. No one had used para-rhyme or these sort of assonantal rhymes in the way, although, of course, Shelley makes use of them in, say, Mask of Anarchy, but not in the considered and thoroughgoing way that Owen does. And Sassoon is a bit impressed by some of these rather 90s-ish poems, but Owen is just transfigured by Sassoon's satirical attacks, and he goes back and he writes The Deadbeat, which is a very kind of, Sassoonish, caustic account of somebody dying in a trench.
Yes, he sends it in a very excited letter to his friend Leslie Gunston, doesn't he? Where he says, I at last I have an event worth a letter. I have beknown myself to Siegfried Sassoon, which is a rather striking way of putting it. After leaving him, I wrote something in Sassoon's style. And as you say, The Deadbeat is nothing like the sort of thing that Owen's writing up till then. And just the first couple of lines, he dropped more sullenly than wearily, became a lump of stench, a clot of meat, and none of us could kick him to his feet. And that really is an exercise in Sassoonism, isn't it?
It's going from one extreme to the other. We should say before, in terms of his war experience in the first months of 1917, he had utterly ghastly experiences. He falls down a shell, it's like a tunnel, really, like the tunnel that we're going to meet in Strange Meeting, and is concussed and spends a couple of days just, at the bottom of a tunnel, waiting to be rescued. He then also has the experience of being shelled and existing for days on end next to a rotting corpse of one of his. So in terms of the experiences that he had at the front, they were traumatizing. And I think Owen's poetry is about trauma, and Strange Meeting is a poem about meeting your traumatizing double or doppelganger. And it uses that kind of gothic doppelganger effect to characterize the utter horror of killing someone in cold blood, or being and dealing with the kind of trench warfare in particular was the sheer helplessness. You're stuck in a trench being shelled day after day and you can't do anything. So shell shock certainly was seen as kind of male hysteria and was frowned upon in officers in particular, so that there was a kind of black mark hanging over Owen from May 1917 to the end, that he somehow didn't have the right stuff in him. What I think we should make clear as well, that for Owen, the trenches were also, I think John Bailey uses this phrase, a sublime homosexual experience, that here he was at close quarters with men in a very, very powerful way. And his use of romance imagery in so many of his poems does derive from a kind of poems such as Futility, for instance, or Exposure, does derive from this sense of male bonding. And Sassoon goes on to introduce him to people like Osbert Sitwell, to Robbie Ross, who was Oscar Wilde's main friend, and to Scott Moncrief, who translates Proust. So he is moving in gay circles in London in the middle of 1918. And to the extent that he is, I wouldn't say he's out, but he does write quite explicitly gay poems such as Who is the God of Canongate, which is basically about visiting a male prostitute as far as one can tell. So there's a sense in which, I'm not saying that Owen ever did, but that he was, there is a homoerotic drive in his poems, which I think is one of the ways which makes them so powerful and effective.
So before we turn to the poem itself, it might be worth underlining perhaps just how entirely crucial the encounter with Sassoon is. There's a very striking letter, isn't there, that Owen writes to Sassoon, in which he says, "You fixed my life, however short. You did not light me. I was always a mad comet, but you have fixed me." So there's an extraordinary sense. It's a little bit like Wordsworth only starting to write like Wordsworth after he's met Coleridge.
Yeah. I think there's no example equivalent of a poet being so transformed by his meeting with a poet. And I think as well, we should say that in terms of the politics of the effect of Owen's poetry, that they had a huge effect they weren't published, he only had 5 poems published in his lifetime. But there was an edition came out in 1920, edited by Sassoon and Edith Sitwell, and then one by Edmund Blunden in 1931. And it had a huge effect on the poets of the 1930s, like Auden, who quotes from Owen in The Orators. And in terms of the kind of pacifist movement of the 30s, Owen was a kind of crucial figure. So the politics, the political effects of the poem were that obviously everyone knows that war is bad. But the effect of poems like Dulce et decorum est, most kind of famously, were to present war in a way which hadn't happened up until that point. So to some extent, in Owen, modernity is born through the war. And the extent to which the romanticism which infuses, say, the sonnets of Rupert Brooke just seems completely hopeless and kind of beside the point after you've read Dulce et decorum est or Strange Meeting. So that romanticism itself, and Strange Meeting is full of echoes of Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth, is meeting its kind of apocalyptic end in the trenches. And Owen is the kind of vector for the end of that kind of belief system.
If you enjoyed this episode, please do try signing up to the Close Reading subscription. You can sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. Just follow the links in the description.